My name is Jarvis Lepper. Welcome to Voices on the Journey. Today we have Dr. Jerry Sittser, Professor of Theology at Whitworth University in Washington. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Jarvis. My pleasure.
Welcome to Canada.
My pleasure again.
We got some snow up here. Rumor has it that you like cross-country skiing.
I do. I do like that, and I do some snowshoeing too. I went cross-country skiing just a couple of weeks ago. Snow in Spokane proper is a little hit and miss, but once you get into the mountains, that we have a lot of snow for many months of the year. It's quite beautiful.
Well, if you come up here, I'll find some for you between December and March.
That's good. That's good. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Jerry specializes in the history of Christianity, Christian spirituality, and religion in public life. And he has written 9 books, including A Grace Disguised, How the Soul Grows Through Loss. And I see on your Facebook that it was recently translated into Korean.
Well, actually, it's a second translation in Korean. They did the first one many years ago. Usually these days, considering the growth of the church in Korea, most books written in English that are translated are almost always translated first or close to first into Korean. I've written 9 books, and I think 6 of them have been translated into Korean. And this now is a second Korean edition, interestingly enough. I just also got a copy of a new French translation as well.
So you better start studying Korean to make sure it's translated right.
Yeah, well, that's kind of low on my priority list right now.
Well, the questions today on the podcast are centered around your book, A Grace Disguised. And it's interesting, whenever I type in books on grief on the internet, your book comes up every single time. So that certainly tells me that you're making a dent into this area. That's pretty amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And loss came suddenly for you a number of years ago in 1991 during a tragic accident that claimed 3 generations of your family, your mother, your wife, and your young daughter. And I know we hear about these stories, these big stories. I know in Nova Scotia, in the province next to me, less than a year ago, 23 people were shot by a gunman, and people are grieving deeply at this time, and it's heart-wrenching to hear these stories. I remember I was watching a TV series a number of years ago, Anne of Green Gables, that took place on PEI, and I heard a line that stood out to me, and it says, "Grief is the price we pay for love."
Yeah, it is. Mm-hmm.
And now most of us don't experience those big moments of grief, but we all taste loss at some point, and we all have a different journey of grief. No 2 stories are the same. So Dr. Jerry, you're going to share a bit of your journey, your story, and we're going to go through these questions. I'm sure you've read C.S. Lewis' work on grief. In his book, Surprised by Joy, he said, "A death of a beloved is an amputation." And Jerry, you said in your book, loss is like an amputation of your identity. Jerry, you had to learn to walk again with an artificial leg, or maybe you felt like you couldn't even walk after what you experienced. How do you walk again after the death of a loved one?
Well, I think it's an apt metaphor. I use it myself, but with a twist. Yes, you do feel like you've suffered an amputation, and as amputees will say, they feel phantom pain. In other words, as if the leg is still there, but when they look down, it's gone. And those phantom pains can go on for years. In the case of suffering a loss of a loved one, those feelings just never go away. The twist is that when you suffer what I call an irreversible loss, say health or a marriage or a loved one, suicide and so many other things like that, it's more like the amputation of the self from the self, especially when somebody that's very close to you, that's part of the core of your very identity, is lost to you. A long-term career, for example, it doesn't necessarily have to mean the loss of a loved one. In that case, it's not like you've just lost a leg. It's like you've lost yourself, because we define ourselves largely in terms of relationship, Jarvis. I mean, I know myself through the eyes and face of my wife, my children, my friends, colleagues at the university. We receive 1,000 inputs a day that are telling us who we are through them. When we look into a mirror, we don't see ourselves, we see what other people see in us and communicate to us. Well, when you lose someone very close to you, you feel like you've in many ways lost yourself. And it takes a long time to sort out a new sense of identity after that irreversible or catastrophic loss. There are two comments I'd want to make about that. The first is that we have to experience, or we have to integrate the experience of loss into our own stories in order to come to a new identity. So to put it this way, I continue to carry those three loved ones with me. And the experience that I suffered so many years ago now, when I lost 3 generations of a family in a drunken driving accident, those experiences, those losses are now part of my identity as a human being. Or better put, it's how I responded to those losses that's a part of my identity. So that's the process of integration after any kind of event of loss. The other thing is to discover how powerful it is to know that your fundamental identity as a Christian is defined by your relationship with God through Jesus Christ. Paul said, "From now on, therefore, we regard no one from a human point of view." Even though he said we once regarded Christ from a human point of view, we regard him thus no longer. If anyone is in Christ, that person is a new creation. The old has passed away. Behold, all things are new. New creation. And sometimes a huge loss can drive us to God to recognize that our fundamental identity is not as a husband or as a father or as a professional, say a university professor, not as a person who's healthy and active. Our fundamental identity is that we belong to Jesus.
And when God looks at us, he says, "Hey, that's my kid." And,
That's right.
and we find our hope, our comfort in that.
Yeah.
And that
God said to Jesus, "You are my beloved son." And he says that to us too. Jarvis, you're my beloved son, or Patricia, my wife, you're my beloved daughter. We belong ultimately to him. At the end of life, that's all we're going to have. As we move from one reality to a much larger reality, that is the kingdom of God.
well said. Now, during this deep pain, you started to study more about God. What did you learn about God in your deep grief?
Well, this is going to sound strange to say, Jarvis, but the first thing I did is that I gave myself permission not to believe for a while. Now, it's not like I disbelieved. It wasn't that either. I guess I would put it this way. I suspended belief. I was so 3 small children that survived the accident with me. We were all together. And so Catherine was 8 and David was 6 and my son John was 2, and he was severely injured in the accident. I mean, we're all injured to some degree, but he was severely injured. And I was so busy and so exhausted and so overwhelmed by grief and by responsibility, I simply didn't have the energy to believe much. But here's what I did. I let the church, the people of God, believe for me. I continue to go to worship, and I take my 3 little ones with me. I couldn't sing because I'd start to cry the minute I began to sing. I couldn't pray. I just sat there like a stump. And I listened to the people around me singing and praying, and they did it for me. They picked me up and carried me for a while. Now I do that with many, many people too. I sing for them. I pray for them. I believe for them as they too face circumstances in which suspension of belief is sometimes the only alternative. I also gave myself to do some pretty serious searching. I asked a lot of questions. I even considered what life would look like in the wake of the loss if I didn't believe in God anymore. And ironically, I recognized that even grief itself requires belief in God. I mean, that sounds strange to say, but the moral category of grief, the sense of deep loss, this feeling like as if the universe itself has turned against you, all the things that happen to us when we face some kind of catastrophic loss only have meaning if there is a God in the first place. Otherwise, who cares? I mean, look at what Hitler did to 9 to 11 million people. Who cares? When God doesn't exist, it opens up all kinds of horrific possibilities. So in one sense, suspending belief in God was the very thing that drove me back to God. I also discovered, Jarvis, the power of the incarnation. In the wake of a big loss, it's inevitable that we're going to ask questions like, where was God? Why didn't God do something? How can God be good and allow this kind of thing to happen? And many people will give abstract answers to that, philosophical answers. But in the Christian faith, the ultimate answer that God gives to the problem of suffering and evil is that God himself embraces suffering. God became a human being, and not a human being that occupied a position of power, say in Rome. This human being, God in human flesh, was born in a stable and suffered death on a cross. God's ultimate answer to suffering is God's suffering. And then the ultimate defeat of suffering, evil, sin, death, and hell itself in the resurrection of the dead. Not resuscitation, but resurrection of the dead. And so those two things in particular were really important for me to recognize that God is not some kind of icy cliff that's windswept and inaccessible to me. God comes all the way to me in the person of Jesus Christ and says, no matter how deep in the pit you've gone, I've gone deeper still.
Good words. I know the only comfort that I get in the midst of my own grief is the reality that God is with us.
In Christ.
Pardon me?
In Christ.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
I know the word on many people's lips during this pandemic is the word resilience. And, it's great to speak about resilience, but this word, which is rooted in the Latin, means to leap back, to rebound, to recover quickly from difficulties. And that's impossible to do. You can't go back to how things were before, especially if someone has passed away. So I think certainly a better word instead of resilience is comfort. And we find our comfort in the reality that God journeys with us. He's before us. And I like what Psalm 98 says, God rolls up his sleeves. That's a promise from him. Yeah. He wants to journey with us and provide help and comfort.
Just to make a comment about that, I do not believe it's possible to recover. I do not believe it's possible to get back to what we were or had before. Those kinds of expectations are vain, in my opinion. What we need to do is not get over something, but grow into it. And as we grow into it, we'll learn to carry it more lightly and more redemptively. And the experiences of loss will be reintegrated into our lives in a redemptive way. That is a real possibility. It shapes our story. It shapes our character. It changes us. But we carry it forward. We integrate it into our lives. We don't get over something.
So we should carry loss in our hearts for the rest of our lives.
And then I think it grows a kind of muscle of the soul. And as that muscle grows, we find ourselves capable of not only carrying our own losses, but also carrying the losses of other people. And that's our job as Christians.
I like what you said about Jesus's words. Can you elaborate on that? Blessed are those who mourn.
Oh, yeah. I mean, he doesn't say, blessed are those who once mourned. It's not a past tense, it's a present tense. Jesus is saying that mourning should be part of a Christian lifestyle. Now, not a kind of miserable mourning where we're constantly falling into pessimism and complaining about life, but a healthy kind of mourning, because there's lots to mourn in a fallen world. And we need to develop the capacity, which to some degree comes through suffering itself, in order to mourn and carry the losses of other people. So mourning, in my mind, should be a lifestyle for Christians, but it's not exclusive of joy. It's possible to be both joyful and to mourn at the same time.
Very true. So don't be scared to look at grief and see where it'll take you.
It takes us on a journey, and it can be, by the grace of God and the support of other people, a healthy and a redemptive one.
Absolutely. Jerry, there are often knee-jerk reactions to grief, and I've heard these phrases come to me. God is punishing you. God has a reason for everything. Time heals all wounds. I know my wife and I, experienced grief when we lost 4 little ones before they were born. And people will say, well, at least you have 3 other ones. And people mean well, but what are other knee-jerk reactions people have that are not healthy?
Yeah. Well, first, it's profoundly human and in 2 ways. The people who go through a loss have their own, or express a knee-jerk reaction in their own particular way. And in this case, there's a reason for it. So I want to start there with the people who've suffered loss, as you did, or as I have, and as most people do eventually. And that is, they want to make sense out of it. It seems like a violation of what they believe about God. And all of a sudden, some big loss just drops right into their laps. And it creates a kind of disorientation. The world doesn't operate according to expectation. There's a kind of terror to it. And then we try to figure out how to organize our life, our world, around this violation of expectation. There are lots of ways of doing it. I mean, we can bargain with God, try to cut some kind of deal with him. That's a way that we react. Another one is to assume responsibility for it. We feel guilty. The reason why I lost my wife is because I was a lousy husband. The reason why I lost my child is because I was a lousy father or a mother or whatever. And sometimes that's true to some degree, but in most cases, we're doing that because we want to make sense out of the universe when it doesn't operate according to expectation. And one of the ways of doing that is simply to take responsibility for it and to blame ourselves. We do that. Another way is we blame other people. It could be the system, it could be the driver, it could be this person or that person. So we sometimes blame ourselves and we sometimes blame other people. That works to some degree, but in the end, all it does is put poison in the soul and ends up killing our spirits. I call that, by the way, the second death. The first death is the immediate experience of loss. The second death is, over the long haul, what can happen in our souls. The kind of poison that blame and guilt and resentment and bitterness produces, that can lead to what I call the death of the soul itself. So there are lots of ways that the people who've suffered loss can express knee-jerk reactions of that kind. Blaming God, obviously, is another one. But the same is true for people who are trying to support people who've suffered loss. They too can exhibit these kinds of knee-jerk reactions, and usually it comes in the form of inept things to say. It might be a Bible verse that's quoted in an untimely way. Not that I deny the truth of the Bible, that's not it at all. But sometimes we use the Bible as an excuse. We don't enter in with people. We drop a Bible verse as if that's going to fix the problem instantly. And of course, you and I know that's not the case. We may be avoidant of people who've suffered loss. They're a kind of terror to us. I had one man say to me about 3 years after the accident, I've avoided you for 3 years because you embodied my worst nightmare. I can't imagine anything worse than losing a spouse, a mother, and a child in the accident. And I couldn't stand being around you. Well, I wanted to say, thanks a lot. That's not very helpful. But it was also profoundly human for him to say that. Anyway, the last thing I want to say about Kneejerk is what I call shortcuts to healing. Those are always tempting for us, Jarvis. We want to figure out how to get back on our feet as quickly as possible. For men, it probably means going back to work right away and filling in their schedules with busyness because they simply don't want to sit in the pain. It could mean, if it's a loss of a spouse, it could mean a very quick remarriage. There are lots of ways that we become avoidant. And the problem with avoidance is that there's always a cost. Either it postpones the work we need to do. You know as well as I do that loss chases us down, and sooner or later it's going to catch up with us. Or we start to lose our own human capacity for love and attachment because we become avoidant over the long haul. We become isolated and self-protective and defensive. And those are all really bad alternatives. Eventually, what happens is that we have to look at the loss squarely and let it have its way with us, but obviously within the larger protection of the people of God, good friends, and ultimately our faith.
I know one of the knee-jerk reactions that I hear all the time is, well, I know how you're feeling. And when it comes to grief, we can't fully understand how the other person feels, but
Yeah.
thankfully, we can be with them when they're feeling.
Yeah.
A ministry of presence.
A ministry of presence, that's exactly right. Yeah, in fact, you asked the question having to do with how people should respond as caregivers or as friends for people who have suffered loss. And as you well know, as a pastor and involved in a church, there are lots of bad things we can do. The best thing we can do is simply be quiet. Say one thing like, oh, Jarvis, I am so sorry for the loss that you have experienced. I haven't gone through that experience myself. I've had my own losses, but I'm sorry for yours. And I just want you to know I'm going to pray for you, and let it go at that. And then simply be silent. You know, after Job went through that catastrophic experience of losing so much in his life, the 3 friends who came to visit him were smart the first week when they simply sat with him and said nothing. Once they started opening their mouths, they got themselves into trouble because they were trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense.
And God got mad at them.
And God said that in spite of Job's doubts and struggles, and even the moments when he shook his fist at God, he said that Job was a more righteous man than those 3 friends who were trying to provide conventional answers to the problem of suffering that simply don't work. So the first thing I'd say is be present and be silent. The second thing is that eventually when a person goes through a significant loss, the team of people surrounding them is going to become very small. It has to. I knew a lot of people when we went through the accident. My wife was quite visible too. She was a soloist, a singer, and she got around. And so there were a lot of people who watched us, and it was a big event. You know, the newspapers across the country covered it and so on and so forth. And I remember saying to a meeting at our church of about 600 people, they asked me to speak about 6 weeks after the accident, because I had been visible at the church. I was a Sunday school teacher, that sort of thing. And I said to them, I know you love me and I know you care about me. I can't explain myself to you anymore. I'm exhausted. I end up having to answer the same question 100 times. And so I'm going to ask you to pray for me. and then let me be, because I can't do this anymore. And the circle of people who really surrounded me, Jarvis, was actually quite small, but they were in it for the long haul. And that's what we have to be. If I'm in the first, if I'm a player on the field, if I'm kind of the first string of supporters, I need to realize that a lot of my work is not in the first month, it's in the first and second and third years. Long-term support and friendship, not necessarily daily, but regularly, faithfully, over a long period of time. Because when you go through a really big loss, sometimes the second and even the third year is harder than the first. And we need those few people who are going to stay with us for a long period of time. It's interesting. I've got one brief story. So Ron and Julie Pyle were really good friends of mine. And Julie and my first wife, Linda, were very good friends. And they were in it with me for the long haul. Julie took care of John, my 2-year-old, and I spent quite a bit of time with them. And they were very, very good to me. Is it any surprise that Ron was in my wedding when I remarried after 20 years? Okay, 20 years later. By the way, we were in a small group that whole time. We're still in that small group together 30 years later. Then Julie got cancer. And now my new wife, second wife, Patricia, is in a small group. She got cancer. We were with him the whole way, all the way to her death 5 years ago. And guess who did Ron's wedding last year? Do you see that sense of continuity? That story that unfolds with a small community of people who are in it over the long haul with us, and then we, in turn, do the same thing for them. Paul talks about that in 2 Corinthians 1.
Absolutely. We need to be a community where the strong help the weak and the weak help the strong.
Yeah.
Very good words. Thank you.
And we all help each other. Yeah. Excuse me.
I remember us sitting in the hospital once, and a young man sat next to me, and he just said to me, not even a hello, he said, I just lost my 8-year-old daughter. And I told him I was lost for words, and I just sat there and said nothing. It's hard to know what to say. Like you feel like you want to say something, but it's just being there with the person as they grieve, as they're hurting.
Few words. I am so sorry. I get a lot of mail. And if anybody has the right to give them answers, it would be me, because they're writing me almost for that reason. But I say the same thing, and I mean it every time. I am so sorry you've suffered this kind of loss. I am so sorry.
I know sometimes we try to push tears out of the way, and I think it's important to share with others. You know, there's room for tears. Somebody once said, never forsake the tears that you cry, because each tear is an honor to that person who passed.
It is indeed, yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And we certainly need to make that space for tears, for grief.
Yeah.
I know someone who just lost their 20-year-old son, and the mom has your book, and she said, I can't get past chapter 3. I think she's revealing a deeper question. What happens when you get stuck in your grief?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, this is going to sound silly. Keep reading the first 3 chapters then. In other words, keep at it, keep in it. Don't put yourself on a timetable. Now, there are some people who do get stuck for a long, long time, and they probably need to do some other work. It probably isn't just the loss itself. It might have to do with an inclination toward anxiety or depression, or other losses that occurred previously that they haven't worked through yet. One of the things that loss does to us, Jarvis, is that it gives us an opportunity to do deeper work, to turn over other stones in our lives. Maybe the loss of a parent when we were a young child, and that a later loss triggers that early loss, and we need to go back and revisit. So my first comment would be always, don't put yourself on a timetable, and don't let other people do it too. The second, though, is if you do feel stuck, ask bigger questions. What's going on? Are there other things? Is there other work I need to do? Other losses I need to attend to? And do I need to find help in order to be able to do that? Sometimes losses provide us with an opportunity to grow as human beings in ways that we did not even know at the time of the occurrence of that particular loss. New doors get opened, new windows. It pushes us to keep growing along the way. A third comment I want to make about that is we need to be careful of expectations, because a lot of people have the expectation that they're going to get over something. And so they define being stuck with, I'm still in this, I'm not, quote, over it yet. And my comment to them would be, as I've mentioned to you before, you won't get over it, but you can grow into it, and you can learn to carry it in a different kind of way. Now, that certainly happened to me over the years. I mean, I'm 30 years out now, Jarvis, and I still cry quite often. And I'm remarried, and I love my new wife just with profound depth. And I still cry over the loss of my first wife and my daughter and my mother. So I'm not over, but I think I've grown into it, and I certainly carry it differently. So a warning there about what we expect when we feel stuck. It could be that we think on the other side, it's going to be as it was before, and that is simply not the case. So look for, don't put yourself in a timetable. Look at the opportunities that loss provides to ask bigger questions about your life. And then the third one would be careful of your expectations. You won't get over, but you can grow into.
I like what the band U2 sings. They say grace makes beauty out of ugly things.
Yes.
And grace invades your book. And what part does grace play in the journey of grief?
Well, it grows flowers out of ashes, doesn't it? I mean, I remember visiting Yellowstone many years ago, Yellowstone National Park, with my 3 kids. We always went to a national park every summer, the 4 of us. And we came upon a hauntingly beautiful scene when we climbed a peak in Yellowstone. There had been a huge fire there maybe 15 years before. And we noticed all of these big trees that were all gray and lifeless, all dead but still standing. I felt like we were walking through a graveyard of burnt lumber, still standing. But underneath it was all kinds of new growth, green, beautiful trees and wildflowers and so on. And the juxtaposition of old and new, dead and alive, was actually extraordinarily beautiful to behold. That's what grace does to us, Jarvis. It brings new out of the old, but it doesn't necessarily put the old away. It's all integrated into a larger landscape we call the redemptive story.
And that gives us hope as we journey forward.
It does give.
And I was reading that one of the Hebrew words for hope means rope.
Oh, yeah, very good.
A single strand is very weak, but when all the strands are bound together, it creates a rope which is unbreakable, and we can hang on to this rope when our world is falling apart.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's very good.
And we find our hope in a other tree, the cross, as we talked about, and the resurrection. And that's where we find real capital L life.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, very good.
Globally, 2.5 million people have died of COVID-19. I've heard of people right here in Canada can't visit their loved ones who are dying. People are postponing funerals. What can the journey of healing look like, even though these things are taken away?
Well, this is a huge problem. In the United States, we've lost 500,000 people now. And you figure if for every loss of a loved one, there are probably 100 people affected minimum, and sometimes it could go up into the thousands. So you multiply 500,000 by 100, you're at a very big number. 50 million. That's 1/6 of our population. So the chain reaction of loss is gigantic in such a short period of time. And all of this has skewed the normal process we go through. I mean, normally there's a family gathering, friends come around you, then there's a memorial service, and there could be 50 people there, there could be 5,000 people there. And then there are meetings afterwards and exchanges and interactions, all those kinds of things. All of that has been taken away from us. Most people in the United States are dying alone. I mean, think about that, dying alone. And if you lose someone in those circumstances, your level of guilt and regret and anger is going to be very, very significant. So all that gets wrapped up. People's anger at those that aren't observant and wearing masks, and on it goes. Well, then you can't even ritualize it afterwards in normal ways. You can't have a gathering. Family can't necessarily even gather. So this has been posed a very, very big problem. And I think we need to acknowledge it. My suggestion would be figure out new ways to ritualize. And have that extend outward. It could be that the memorial service will be 6 months from now, or could you please send in letters, and we're going to put together, and photos, and we're going to put together a photo album and print it up, through Apple or some other kind of medium where it can be a beautiful kind of book. Do a YouTube or a film display you can send out to people. Those kinds of new ways of ritualizing are going to help us to move from what experts call grieving to mourning. Grieving is the emotion. Mourning is the way we ritualize grieving so that it works in a healthy way in our lives. And we're going to have to be creative in figuring out new ways to ritualize. Let me give you an example of a former student of ours, now lives in North Carolina. He went to Duke, and he's married, working there in Durham, North Carolina. And he's one of my son's best friends. And they gave birth to a baby a year ago, last Monday. The baby was premature, had some physical problems, and after about a month, the baby died. Well, it was during COVID. And so they could do nothing. The church wasn't meeting in person. They couldn't have any kind of memorial service. So they decided to have a memorial service at the birthday, the first birthday, or what would have been the first birthday of the baby. And they did a Zoom, and I participated in it. There were, 300 screens. So a lot of people attended. And my son spoke. The couple spoke. There was music. It was beautiful, Jarvis. It was a holy event. And one of the things that made it so cool, on my screen, I had my son and daughter-in-law's picture showing because he spoke. I had Evan and Lucy, the parents. I had the pastor I knew, their pastor, I know him really well. So I could look at their faces the entire time. This event was happening a year later over Zoom. So that's one creative option of people who are going to have to figure out new ways of ritualizing a significant loss. But it's possible.
Yeah, it forces us to be creative.
It does.
Darkness is real, but so is light. Pain is real, but so is hope.
That's exactly right. Even the darkness is not dark to thee. The night is bright as the day, for darkness is as light to thee, or with thee. It says in Psalm 139. It's beautiful.
That's beautiful indeed. I know you shared a story already about trees. Can you also share that story about the oak tree as we close?
Actually, I had, in the wake of our tragedy, that's a big event, I had a number of dreams. And I have several of those in the book, and I can't tell you the amount of feedback I've gotten. I mean, I've gotten thousands of letters over the years, and I would say 1 in 5, maybe even more than that, mentions one of those waking dreams. So I'm going to actually mention 2 instead of 1. One is that I was chasing after the sun as it was moving toward the horizon and about to set. And I remember in this dream running frantically. I was sweating profusely. I was utterly terrified, chasing after a sun that was faster than I was. And so eventually hit the horizon and then sunk uh, beyond the horizon until it was gone. And then I remember stopping and feeling this sense of utter existential terror when I looked over my shoulder and saw the darkness coming over me. And I woke up and thought, I'm going to be in darkness for the rest of my life. That's how it felt. That this darkness was not simply a dream, it was a kind of metaphor for what was going to happen to my entire life. And needless to say, I was disturbed beyond words. Well, I talked to my sister about this. She's a very close friend of mine a few days later, and she said, Jerry, I think this might actually be a cue and a source of hope. As long as you keep running west to stay in the fiery warmth of the sun, the longer you're going to be in darkness once the sun sets. But if you turn east and head into the darkness, you will come all the sooner to the sunrise. And that was a cue to me. And I tried to do that. I tried to turn and face the darkness rather than run away from it. And I did indeed come to the sunrise. Now, ironically, as you can guess by now, I carry the darkness with me to this day. But I do live in light at the same time. That's why Psalm 139 is so important to me. The other one you're referring to is this dream. In the dream, I'm living in a home much like ours, and there's a beautiful oak tree in the backyard, huge tree, maybe 200 years old. And that tree becomes a kind of metaphor for our family life. There's a swing in it. We picnic underneath it. Kids climb it. There's a fort in it. You get the idea. It's kind of a metaphor for the beauty and warmth and richness of our family life. Well, the tree gets a disease and it has to be cut down. And every time I look out the kitchen window to that backyard, all I see is that empty space and that ugly stump. And it becomes a metaphor now for what I've lost. In the dream, I finally realized that though I can't have that tree back again, I can plant around it. So I choose to keep the stump. Let it just sit there, reminding me of what's been lost, but then plant grass, flowers, perennials, bushes, so that I'm landscaping around the stump. And that, again, was so important to me, Jarvis. And that's exactly what I chose to do, is plant around the stump. The first thing for me, the first order of business, was figuring out how to be a single dad for 3 traumatized children, and how to become a family of 4 rather than a family of 6. And we did that. I mean, my kids are all grown and gone now. 2 have moved back to Spokane, and so I see my grandchildren a lot. My 3rd just lives in Seattle. They're wonderful people. They're all married. They're good parents. 10 years ago, I remarried, and I remarried a lovely Christian woman whose 2 daughters, ironically, are best friends to my 2 boys. And they too live in Spokane now. They moved back with their kids. And we have vacation every summer together now as a family of 21. It's a very rich life, but the stump remains, Jarvis. It has to remain. It will never go away. But now, because I've been replanting for so long, a lot of those perennials are looking pretty good.
You have a big garden.
I have a big garden. Yeah, that's exactly right. But I will never forget the stump.
Well, we can certainly see beauty, grace in the midst of loss. And thank you for opening our eyes today to that. As as we close, I want to share these words that I read from a professor at Houston Baptist University. The words say, "The question of evil appears to be eternal, but in fact, evil had a beginning and it will have an end."
It certainly will. And the decisive battle against evil was fought 2,000 years ago. And that was the turning point of the war against evil. Not against a political party, not even against Hitler, but evil as embodied by hell itself and by the corruption in every human heart in the entire history of the world. When Jesus Christ died and rose from the dead, the decisive battle was won. And now it's all mop-up operation until the kingdom comes.
We often think evil is over in a different country, as you said, but the line of evil runs right down in the middle of our hearts.
I mean, it's a Solzhenitsyn quote, and it's an amazing quote that in the end, it cuts right through everything. Every person, every family, every church, every country, every political party, everything.
And we also have that hope to turn on to, that new life, forgiveness and peace, and we don't want to trade it for anything in the world.
We certainly don't, and I certainly won't.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your...
Jarvis, you're a good man. Really, really nice to visit with you. Appreciate it a lot.
Yeah, and this will be a wonderful resource for others who tune into this podcast.
Okay, thank you. God bless you.
You as well. Thank you.